How Islam began did not involve a sudden or isolated moment in history. It took shape in the social, religious, and economic world of 7th century Arabia, a landscape of tribal loyalties, trade routes, and competing beliefs. In the early 7th century, Islam began with the prophetic mission of Muhammad, who, according to Islamic tradition, received revelations that would form the Quran. As these messages spread, a new religious community began to form, shaped not only by revelation but by the historical conditions of its time. This is the history of how Islam began. In the late 6th century CE, the Arabian Peninsula occupied a peripheral position within the political geography of the Old World. It lay between two established imperial systems, the Byzantine Empire to the northwest and the Sasanian Empire to the northeast. These empires governed through centralized administrations, standing armies, and formal systems of taxation. Arabia, by contrast, remained largely outside direct imperial control. Its societies developed under different conditions, shaped by geography, mobility, and kin-based organization. The peninsula was environmentally diverse. Much of its interior consisted of arid desert, unsuitable for sustained agriculture. Permanent settlement was concentrated in oases, coastal zones, and the southern highlands. The scarcity of arable land limited urban growth and constrained the emergence of centralized political institutions. As a result, Arabia did not produce a territorial state comparable to those of Syria, Mesopotamia, or Egypt. Authority rested instead in tribal structures and negotiated relationships. Arab society during this period was organized primarily around tribes and clans, linked through real or constructed genealogies. Kinship determined legal responsibility, protection, and social standing. There was no uniform legal system operating across the peninsula. Disputes were resolved through customary law, arbitration by recognized figures, compensation payments, or retaliation. Long-standing feuds between clans were common, and cycles of violence could persist across generations. Social order depended on reputation and collective strength rather than institutional enforcement. Despite the absence of centralized governance, Arabia was integrated into regional exchange networks. Long-distance trade connected the peninsula to the Indian Ocean, East Africa, the Levant, and Mesopotamia. Caravans transported goods such as incense, spices, leather, textiles, and metals. These routes operated seasonally and required negotiated passage through tribal territories. Control over wells, pasture land, and caravan corridors conferred economic leverage and political influence. In Western Arabia, the settlement of Mecca occupied a distinct position. Mecca lacked agricultural resources and did not function as a political capital. Its importance derived from trade coordination and religious activity. Located along caravan routes linking southern Arabia with Syria, the town benefited from commercial traffic managed by leading families of the Quraysh tribe. Mecca's religious significance centered on the Kaaba, a sanctuary housing cultic objects associated with multiple tribal deities. The Kaaba functioned as a pilgrimage destination, attracting visitors from across the peninsula. Pilgrimage seasons coincided with periods of restricted violence, during which fighting was limited. These intervals facilitated trade, negotiation, and dispute resolution among visiting groups. Religious practice and economic exchange were therefore closely linked. Religious life in pre-Islamic Arabia was characterized by pluralism. Polytheism was widespread, with deities associated with specific tribes, regions, or functions. Ritual practices included offerings, vows, and pilgrimage. There was no standardized theology, priesthood, or centralized authority overseeing worship. Alongside polytheistic practice, monotheistic communities were present in several regions. Jewish groups were established in oasis settlements such as Yathrib, Khaybar, and Tema, where they engaged in agriculture, trade, and crafts. These communities maintained written religious traditions and legal norms. Christian groups were found in the northern and southern margins of Arabia, influenced by Byzantine and Ethiopian spheres of power. Certain Arab tribes served as military allies of the Byzantine Empire along its southern frontier. In addition to organized Jewish and Christian communities, individual Arabs expressed dissatisfaction with polytheistic worship and sought monotheistic belief associated with the Abrahamic tradition. These figures did not form a unified movement, but their presence reflects the circulation of religious ideas within Arabia during the late antique period. The broader geopolitical environment also shaped Arabian society. The Byzantine and Sasanian empires were engaged in prolonged conflict during the late 6th and early 7th centuries. These wars strained imperial resources and disrupted regional trade. While Arabia itself was not a central theater of conflict, imperial authorities relied on Arab intermediaries and allied tribes to secure frontier zones, reinforcing the political significance of tribal leadership. Economic conditions within Arabian settlements were uneven. Merchant elites accumulated wealth through trade networks and alliance structures. Many individuals lived at subsistence levels, dependent on kin support or patronage. Slavery was integrated into domestic and economic systems. Orphans, widows, and the poor lacked institutional protection and relied on customary obligations for survival. Cultural transmission in Arabia was predominantly oral. Poetry served as a primary vehicle for preserving genealogy, recounting conflicts, and asserting social status. Poets articulated tribal memory and negotiated honor through performance. This oral culture enabled the wide dissemination of ideas even in the absence of extensive literacy. By the end of the 6th century, Arabia displayed several defining characteristics: decentralized authority, kin-based social organization, religious diversity, reliance on trade and pilgrimage, and integration into broader late antique networks without direct imperial rule. These conditions produced a stable but tension-prone social environment shaped by inequality, intertribal conflict, and exposure to competing religious traditions. Islam would emerge from within this world rather than from outside it. The absence of centralized institutions allowed new forms of authority to develop beyond established structures. The presence of monotheistic traditions provided points of reference, while oral culture facilitated the transmission of new teachings. By 610 CE, Arabia was politically fragmented, socially complex, and religiously diverse. It was a functioning society with established norms, not an empty landscape. In 570 CE, Muhammad was born in the town of Mecca in western Arabia. His birth occurred within the Quraysh tribe, a dominant tribal confederation that controlled Mecca's religious sanctuary and managed much of its commercial activity. Muhammad's family belonged to the Banu Hashim clan, one of several Quraysh lineages. While respected for its lineage, the clan did not rank among the wealthiest or most politically powerful in Mecca. Muhammad's father died before his birth. His mother died when he was still a child. As a result, Muhammad grew up without parental protection, moving between guardianship arrangements within his extended family. In Arabian society, Orphanhood carried material and social vulnerability. Protection depended on the kin's willingness and capacity rather than institutional support. Muhammad's early life, therefore, unfolded within the customary systems of tribal responsibility. During his youth, Muhammad lived within Meccan society and participated in its daily economic and social rhythms. Mecca did not provide agricultural employment. Livelihood depended on trade, animal husbandry, and service within extended households. As he grew older, Muhammad became involved in commercial activity. This work included participation in the caravan trade, which connected Mecca to markets in Syria and other regions. Caravan trade required negotiation, reliability, and the ability to manage goods over long distances under uncertain conditions. By early adulthood, Muhammad developed a reputation for reliability in commercial dealings. Later Islamic tradition preserves the title al-Amin, meaning the trustworthy, associated with his conduct. From a historical perspective, such a reputation would have been valuable in Mecca's trade-based economy, where trust functioned as a form of capital. Merchants depended on agents who could safeguard goods, honor agreements, and navigate intertribal interactions. Muhammad's commercial activity brought him into contact with different regions and social environments beyond Mecca. Trade journeys exposed participants to communities influenced by Byzantine and Near Eastern cultures, where Jewish and Christian populations were more visible. While the extent of direct religious exchange cannot be precisely reconstructed, such contact was a normal feature of long-distance trade in late antiquity and contributed to the circulation of ideas across regions. At some point in his adult life, Muhammad married Khadija, a widow engaged in commercial enterprise. The marriage provided economic stability and social standing within Mecca. It also situated Muhammad within a household that was integrated into Meccan trade networks. Marriage alliances in Mecca reinforced clan relationships and economic cooperation. Muhammad's marriage followed established social patterns rather than marking a departure from Meccan norms. During the decades before 610 CE, Muhammad lived as a member of Meccan society rather than as a public dissenter. He did not occupy a formal leadership position within the Quraysh, nor did he act as a religious official. Mecca did not possess a priesthood in the institutional sense. Religious practice was decentralized, conducted through family and tribal observance at sanctuaries. Participation in pilgrimage rituals formed part of communal life. At the same time, Meccan society exhibited tensions that were visible to all inhabitants. Wealth distribution was uneven, with merchant elites controlling significant resources while others lived at subsistence levels. Slavery was embedded in household economies. Orphans and widows relied on kin support. Disputes between clans periodically escalated into violence. These features were not unique to Mecca, but reflected broader patterns of Arabian social organization. Sources describing Muhammad's pre-prophetic life emphasize his participation in arbitration and dispute resolution within Meccan society. While later accounts may emphasize such episodes to highlight personal qualities, the underlying practice of arbitration is historically attested in Arabian custom. Muhammad's religious practice before 610 CE cannot be reconstructed with precision. Pre-Islamic Arabia did not maintain personal religious records, and later sources were composed after the emergence of Islam. Its leadership sought to preserve the status quo that sustained trade and pilgrimage. Religious practices tied to the Kaaba were integral to this system. Challenges to these practices would have implications beyond belief, affecting economic flows and intertribal relations. Muhammad reached approximately 40 years of age around 610 CE. In Arabian culture, this stage of life was associated with maturity and social credibility. Elders held authority in arbitration and counsel. Individuals at this age were expected to possess judgment formed through experience rather than youthful ambition. Before 610 CE, Muhammad did not publicly challenge Meccan religious practices or social arrangements. There is no evidence of organized opposition or public preaching before this point. His life followed recognizable patterns of Meccan society: kin affiliation, trade participation, marriage, and communal involvement. This continuity is historically significant. Islam did not emerge from a figure already positioned outside society, but from an individual embedded within it. Before that year, Muhammad functioned as a Meccan merchant and clan member. After it, he claimed a new role that altered his relationship to Meccan society. The distinction between these phases is essential for understanding the origins of Islam as a historical process rather than as a retroactively unified narrative. Late antique Arabia did not produce prophets through institutional mechanisms. Prophetic claims, when they occurred, emerged within existing social frameworks and disrupted them. The credibility of such claims depended in part on the claimant's standing within society. Muhammad's prior reputation for reliability and his integration into Meccan life shaped how his later claims were received, both by followers and opponents. By the early 7th century, the town of Mecca functioned as a stable but tightly regulated social environment. Religious practice, commercial activity, and tribal authority were closely linked. The Kaaba stood at the center of Meccan life, serving as a sanctuary associated with multiple deities and as a focal point for pilgrimage. The Quraysh tribe managed the site and benefited economically and politically from its status. Religious continuity reinforced social order. It was within this environment that a decisive break occurred in 610 CE. According to later Islamic tradition, in that year, Muhammad, then approximately 40 years old, experienced what he identified as the first in a series of divine revelations. The event is traditionally located near Mecca during a period of withdrawal from daily activity. From a historical standpoint, the precise circumstances of the experience cannot be independently verified. What can be established is that Muhammad began, from this point forward, to claim the reception of messages that carried religious authority and demanded public communication. This moment marks the beginning of Islam as a historical phenomenon. Before 610 CE, Muhammad functioned as a Meccan merchant and clan member. After this point, he asserted a new role that redefined his relationship to Meccan society. The distinction is fundamental. Historians identify 610 CE as the start of Islam, not because of later developments, but because this is the first moment at which a coherent religious message was claimed and articulated. The early content of the revelations, as preserved in later sources, emphasized several core ideas: the existence of a single, supreme deity, moral accountability, judgment, and the obligation to reject other objects of worship. The earliest phase involved private transmission to individuals within Muhammad's immediate social circle. This pattern is consistent with how new religious claims often emerged in environments lacking institutional support. At this stage, Islam did not exist as a community, institution, or political force. It is the point at which a new form of authority entered the Arabian religious landscape. The early revelations were not compiled into a written text during this initial phase. Transmission occurred orally, consistent with Arabian cultural practice. Recitation functioned as the primary means of preservation and communication. Oral transmission allowed the message to circulate without reliance on literacy or institutional infrastructure. In late antique Arabia, poetry, genealogy, and legal precedent were preserved and transmitted orally with high levels of accuracy. The preservation of early Islamic proclamations within an oral framework aligns with known cultural practices. The beginning of Islam did not immediately produce visible structural change in Mecca. There was no mass conversion in 610 CE. There was no immediate conflict. The existing social order continued to function. What changed was the presence of an alternative religious claim that demanded exclusive allegiance. The reaction of Meccan society during this earliest phase appears to have been limited and cautious. The proclamation did not yet threaten the balance of power directly. As long as it remained confined to a small circle, it did not disrupt pilgrimage or trade. Opposition intensified only later, when public proclamation expanded and conversion increased. The year 610 CE, therefore, represents a moment of initiation rather than transformation. Islam began as a message before it became a movement. It existed first as a proclamation before it produced a community. Historians emphasize this distinction to avoid retrospective distortion. Later developments, conflict, migration, and state formation can obscure the modest scale of the beginning. In 610 CE, Islam consisted of a claim, a message, and a small number of adherents. The claim of revelation also altered Muhammad's personal position within Meccan society. Previously, his authority rested on reputation and clan affiliation. After 610 CE, his authority rested on claimed access to divine communication. This shift would later bring him into conflict with established structures, but at this stage, it primarily marked a change in role. From a documentary perspective, it is essential to separate what can be historically described from what belongs to theological belief. Historians cannot verify the divine origin of the revelations. They can, however, document the emergence of a proclaimed message, its content as preserved in later sources, and its social consequences. The identification of 610 CE as the beginning of Islam reflects this methodological approach. It does not depend on later success or institutionalization. It depends on the appearance of a new religious claim that can be historically situated and traced. This year also establishes the chronological framework for the subsequent phases of Islamic history. Without 610 CE, there is no meaningful starting point. Without distinguishing this moment from later developments, the emergence of Islam becomes indistinct. By anchoring the beginning of Islam in 610 CE, historians maintain analytical clarity. The religion begins with a proclamation. Community formation follows later. Political authority emerges later still. The transition initiated in 610 CE did not resolve the tensions of Meccan society. It introduced new ones. These tensions would develop over the next 12 years as the message moved from private communication to public challenge. That development belongs to the next phase. Following the initial proclamation dated to 610 CE, Islam entered a prolonged phase during which it existed as a small and socially marginal movement within Meccan society. For more than a decade, from 610 to 622 CE, those who accepted Muhammad's message formed a minority community without political authority, military capacity, or territorial control. This period, commonly referred to as the Meccan phase, is defined by asymmetry of power between the emerging Muslim group and the established leadership of Mecca. After the first claimed revelations, Muhammad continued to communicate the message to individuals within his immediate social environment. Over time, the proclamation expanded beyond private circles. As the message became more widely known, it drew attention from Meccan elites, particularly members of the Quraysh who exercised authority over religious and commercial life. The content of the message, as preserved in later sources, asserted the exclusive worship of a single deity and rejected the legitimacy of other objects of worship. In the context of Mecca, this claim carried implications that extended beyond belief. The Kaaba functioned as a sanctuary associated with multiple deities and attracted pilgrims from across Arabia. The management of pilgrimage sustained Mecca's economy and reinforced the prestige of the Quraysh. Challenges to polytheistic practice, therefore, intersect with economic and political interests. As public awareness of the message increased, opposition from Meccan society intensified. The emerging Muslim group did not possess the numbers or alliances required to counter this opposition. Their vulnerability was shaped by the same tribal structures that organized Meccan society. Individuals without strong clan protection were particularly exposed to pressure, while those belonging to influential lineages experienced relative insulation. Early adherents to Islam came from varied social backgrounds. Later Islamic tradition preserves the names of individuals from merchant families, as well as enslaved persons and members of less powerful clans. From a historical perspective, this diversity is consistent with patterns observed in other new religious movements operating within stratified societies. Acceptance of the message did not correlate with a single social category. Opposition to the movement took multiple forms. These included social pressure, ridicule, and exclusion from communal activities. Economic measures were also employed. Members of the emerging Muslim group could be isolated from trade networks or denied customary protections. In a society where survival depended on kin support and economic access, such measures carried serious consequences. Physical coercion is also attested in later sources. Accounts describe individuals subjected to violence or restraint. While the precise details of specific incidents cannot always be independently verified, the broader pattern of coercive pressure is consistent with what is known about enforcement mechanisms in non-centralized societies. Without formal courts or prisons, punishment took the form of direct action by kin groups or dominant factions. Throughout this period, the Muslim group did not respond with organized violence. There is no evidence of armed resistance during the Meccan phase. The absence of military engagement reflects structural limitations rather than strategic choice. The community lacked the resources, alliances, and numbers required for sustained confrontation. The position of Muhammad during this phase remained precarious. His personal safety depended in part on clan affiliation. The Banu Hashim provided a degree of protection, limiting the extent of direct action that could be taken against him. This protection did not extend uniformly to all followers, reinforcing internal disparities within the group. As pressure increased, some members of the Muslim group sought relief through relocation. Later sources describe a movement of individuals to regions outside Mecca where local authorities provided protection. These movements did not constitute a mass migration, but illustrate the constraints under which the community operated. Relocation functioned as a temporary response to local conditions rather than a structural solution. Within Mecca, the Muslim group maintained its existence through interpersonal networks rather than formal institutions. There was no central meeting place, no codified law, and no administrative structure. Transmission of the message continued orally. Gatherings, when they occurred, were small and informal. The period from 610 to 622 CE also witnessed gradual numerical growth. The rate of conversion appears to have been limited. There is no evidence of sudden expansion or mass adherence during this phase. The movement remained a minority within Meccan society, and its visibility increased primarily through sustained proclamation rather than demographic dominance. Opposition from Meccan elites hardened as the message persisted. Negotiation attempts are recorded in later tradition, suggesting efforts to contain or neutralize the movement without resorting to uncontrolled violence. These efforts reflect the balancing act faced by Meccan leadership, which sought to preserve social stability while defending established norms. The continued existence of the Muslim group despite sustained pressure indicates that opposition did not achieve its intended effect. However, endurance should not be conflated with security. The group's position remained unstable. There was no mechanism to ensure long-term protection within Mecca's existing social framework. By the early 620 CE, the limitations of remaining in Mecca had become evident. The movement had reached a point at which further growth or stabilization within the city was constrained by structural factors. Meccan society was not configured to accommodate a religious movement that rejected its foundational practices. At the same time, contacts beyond Mecca introduced new possibilities. Interactions with visitors from other settlements created avenues for negotiation outside the immediate control of Quraysh leadership. These interactions did not immediately alter the situation, but contributed to the emergence of alternatives. The years leading up to 622 CE, therefore, represent a transitional phase. Islam existed as a defined religious proclamation and a recognizable group, but without institutional support. Its survival depended on personal networks, limited protection arrangements, and the absence of unified suppression. From a historical standpoint, this period illustrates the vulnerability of early Islam and challenges simplified narratives of inevitable success. For 12 years, the movement remained marginal. Its continuation cannot be explained by political power, economic dominance, or military strength, none of which it possessed. The significance of the Meccan phase lies in its demonstration of continuity. The message proclaimed in 610 CE persisted despite sustained opposition. The group that accepted it maintained coherence without formal organization. This continuity provided the foundation for later developments, but did not determine them. By 622 CE, circumstances reached a point at which remaining in Mecca no longer offered a viable path for survival or expansion. By the early 7th century, conditions in Mecca had reached a point at which the continued existence of the Muslim group within the city faced structural limits. Islam between 610 and 622 CE functioned as a minority movement without political protection or institutional support. That transition is known in Islamic tradition as the Hijra, the migration of Muhammad and his followers from Mecca to another settlement in Western Arabia. From a historical standpoint, the Hijra represents a shift in the social and political location of Islam rather than the beginning of its message. The message had already existed for more than a decade. What changed in 622 CE was the environment in which that message operated. The destination of the migration was a town known at the time as Yathrib, later called Medina. Yathrib differed from Mecca in several important respects. It was an agricultural settlement rather than a trade-based sanctuary town. Its economy depended on oasis farming, including date cultivation, supported by irrigation and seasonal labor. The town's population consisted of multiple Arab clans as well as established Jewish communities. Political authority in Yathrib was fragmented, and disputes among its groups had persisted for years without resolution. Contacts between Muhammad and individuals from Yathrib developed before 622 CE. These contacts occurred through encounters during pilgrimage seasons and other interregional interactions common in Arabian society. From a historical perspective, such encounters illustrate the permeability of social boundaries in Arabia. Religious ideas, alliances, and negotiations often crossed tribal and settlement lines. In 622 CE, arrangements were made for Muhammad and his followers to relocate to Yathrib. The migration did not occur as a single mass movement. It unfolded in stages, with individuals and small groups leaving Mecca over time. This pattern reflects both logistical constraints and the need to avoid confrontation with Meccan authorities. Movement between settlements was common in Arabia, but relocation on this scale represented a significant reorientation for the Muslim group. Muhammad's departure from Mecca marked the conclusion of Islam's Meccan phase. With his arrival in Yathrib, the center of the movement shifted permanently. The town would soon be known as Medina, meaning the city, reflecting its new role as the primary locus of the Muslim community. The Hijra acquired foundational significance in later Islamic tradition, but its historical importance can be described without recourse to theological interpretation. It was the moment at which Islam ceased to exist solely as a proclamation within a hostile environment and began to function as a community embedded within a different social structure. In Medina, Muhammad assumed a role that differed fundamentally from his position in Mecca. In Mecca, he had operated without formal authority, relying on limited clan protection. In Medina, he became a central figure in managing relations among diverse groups. His authority extended beyond religious proclamation to include arbitration and coordination among the town's inhabitants. This shift did not occur through the imposition of external power. Medina lacked a dominant ruling group capable of enforcing centralized control. Authority depended on negotiation, agreement, and recognized leadership. The Muslim migrants, known in later sources as the Muhajirin, joined with local supporters, later called the Ansar. Together, they formed a new collective that cut across existing clan divisions. From a historical standpoint, this collective represents the earliest form of the Islamic community, commonly referred to as the Ummah. The term denotes a community defined by shared affiliation rather than by kinship alone. This marked a departure from prevailing tribal norms, which tied loyalty primarily to lineage. The formation of the Ummah did not dissolve existing social structures overnight. Clans continued to exist, and previous affiliations remained relevant. What changed was the introduction of a new layer of identity that organized cooperation and responsibility beyond kinship boundaries. One of the earliest documented outcomes of this transition is a set of agreements regulating relations among the inhabitants of Medina. Later Islamic sources preserve these arrangements as a written document outlining mutual obligations, mechanisms for dispute resolution, and principles governing collective security. From a historical perspective, the existence of such agreements indicates an effort to formalize coexistence among groups with different religious and social affiliations. These arrangements recognize the presence of Jewish communities alongside Muslims and other groups within Medina. They established frameworks for collective defense and internal order without requiring uniform religious adherence. This reflects the pragmatic realities of settlement governance in a fragmented political environment. The Hijra also introduced new logistical challenges. The Muslim migrants arrived in Medina without established agricultural resources or property. Integration required the redistribution of labor, access to land, and incorporation into local economic systems. These processes unfolded over time and depended on negotiated support rather than centralized planning. From 622 CE onward, Islam functioned within a community that possessed a degree of territorial stability. Medina provided a base from which the movement could organize daily life, manage resources, and regulate internal relations. This did not constitute a state in the formal sense, but it represented a significant step toward institutional development. The decision to migrate rather than confront Meccan opposition directly is best understood as a response to structural constraints rather than as a tactical maneuver. Mecca's social order could not accommodate a movement that rejected its religious foundations. Medina, by contrast, offered an environment in which no single group held decisive authority, creating space for new arrangements. The Hijra also established a new chronological framework. In later Islamic practice, 622 CE became the starting point of the Islamic calendar. This choice reflects the significance attributed to community formation rather than to the initial proclamation of the message. From a historical perspective, the calendar underscores the importance of institutional viability in the development of religious movements. It is essential to note that the Hijra did not immediately resolve all challenges facing the Muslim community. The relocation created new dynamics with Meccan leadership, surrounding tribes, and internal Medinan groups. These dynamics would shape subsequent events, including conflict and alliance formation. What can be stated with confidence is that 622 CE marks a qualitative transformation. Islam transitioned from a persecuted minority within a dominant society to a community capable of organizing its affairs within a defined settlement. Authority shifted from informal proclamation to recognized leadership embedded in social structures. This transformation does not negate the importance of earlier years. The message proclaimed between 610 and 622 CE remained the foundation of the community formed after the Hijra. The content of belief did not change in 622 CE. What changed was the social framework that sustained it. From a documentary perspective, the Hijra represents the midpoint of Islam's formative period. It divides the early history of Islam into two distinct phases: proclamation without power and community with organizational capacity. Without this transition, later developments cannot be understood. The Hijra also illustrates a broader pattern observed in the history of religious movements. Survival often depends on the ability to relocate into environments that permit institutional growth. Islam's early history fits this pattern without requiring assumptions about inevitability or exceptionalism. By the end of 622 CE, the Muslim community was established in Medina as a recognizable social entity. It possessed leadership, agreements governing internal relations, and a territorial base. After the relocation to Medina in 622 CE, the Muslim community entered a new phase defined by sustained interaction with surrounding groups. The Hijra had provided territorial stability and a framework for internal organization, but it did not resolve the movement's external vulnerabilities. From 622 to 630 CE, Islam existed within a contested regional environment shaped by intertribal competition, economic interests, and unresolved tensions with Mecca. Medina was not an isolated settlement. It lay along routes used by caravans moving between southern Arabia and the Levant. Control of these routes was a recurring source of conflict in western Arabia. Meccan merchants depended on access to northern markets, while Medinan groups sought to protect their own economic interests. The relocation of the Muslim community altered existing relationships along these corridors. During the early Medinan period, interactions between the Muslim community and Meccan leadership increasingly involved confrontation. These confrontations did not occur in a vacuum. In Arabian society, disputes between groups often escalated through raids, counter-raids, and negotiated settlements. Such actions functioned as instruments of pressure rather than as total warfare. From a historical standpoint, the conflicts of this period should be understood within the norms of late antique Arabian society. There was no standing army, no centralized state authority, and no permanent borders. Power was exercised through alliances, mobility, and control of resources. Violence was episodic and limited in scale, shaped by practical constraints. Between 622 and 624 CE, the Muslim community in Medina remained relatively small. Its survival depended on maintaining internal cohesion while managing external threats. Alliances with local clans played a critical role. These alliances were not ideological in nature. They followed established Arabian practices of mutual support and obligation. The relationship between the Muslim community and Jewish groups in Medina also formed part of this complex environment. Jewish clans possessed their own alliances, economic interests, and internal leadership. Cooperation and tension coexisted, reflecting the broader dynamics of the settlement. From a historical perspective, These interactions were shaped by political considerations rather than by abstract theological disputes. The period also saw the emergence of open-armed encounters between Muslim groups and Meccan forces. These encounters are recorded in later sources as discrete engagements rather than continuous campaigns. Their outcomes influenced regional perceptions of the Muslim community's viability. One of the earliest such encounters occurred in 624 CE. While later Islamic tradition assigns symbolic importance to this event, its immediate historical significance lay in demonstrating that the Muslim group could survive confrontation with a larger Meccan force. In the context of Arabian conflict, norms, survival, and withdrawal were often as consequential as decisive victory. Subsequent encounters produced mixed outcomes. In 625 CE, Meccan forces mounted a larger expedition toward Medina. The resulting confrontation did not eliminate the Muslim community, but it exposed its vulnerabilities and the limits of its defensive capacity. In Arabian terms, such outcomes were not unusual. Conflicts rarely produced permanent resolutions. By 627 CE, the pattern of confrontation had shifted again. Meccan leadership, supported by allied tribes, sought to exert pressure on Medina through coordinated action. The failure of this effort marked a turning point. It demonstrated the difficulty of suppressing the Muslim community through confrontation alone. Throughout these years, the Muslim community continued to rely on alliances. Some tribes entered into agreements with Muhammad, recognizing his authority as an arbiter or ally. These agreements did not require conversion to Islam. They followed existing patterns of intertribal diplomacy, emphasizing mutual defense and non-aggression. The growth of such alliances gradually altered the balance of power in Western Arabia. Mecca remained an influential center, but its ability to isolate or eliminate the Muslim community diminished. The region did not fall under centralized control, but patterns of allegiance shifted. Economic considerations played an ongoing role. Access to trade routes, markets, and resources influenced decisions made by various groups. Control over movement and exchange could exert pressure without sustained violence. These factors are essential for understanding why conflict during this period did not escalate into continuous warfare. Internally, the Muslim community in Medina developed mechanisms for coordination and discipline. Leadership structures remained relatively simple. Authority centered on Muhammad, whose role combined religious proclamation with mediation and decision-making. This concentration of authority reduced internal fragmentation but did not eliminate disagreement. The period from 622 to 630 CE also involved internal challenges. Loyalty within the community was not uniform. Some individuals and groups maintained ambiguous relationships with the emerging order. Managing these relationships required negotiation and pragmatic accommodation rather than coercion. By the late 620 CE, the cumulative effect of alliances, confrontations, and negotiated settlements had reshaped the regional environment. The Muslim community was no longer confined to Medina. Its influence extended through networks of obligation and recognition across Western Arabia. The relationship between the Muslim community and Mecca evolved accordingly. Confrontation gave way to periods of negotiation and limited engagement. Agreements regulating movement and access reduced the likelihood of open conflict, even as underlying rivalries persisted. In 628 CE, arrangements were reached that altered the dynamics between the two sides. These arrangements did not represent a final settlement. but they reduced immediate hostilities and allowed broader interaction. Such agreements were consistent with Arabian diplomatic practice, which favored temporary truces and renegotiation. Over the following 2 years, the Muslim community's position strengthened further. Additional groups entered into alliances or acknowledged Muhammad's authority. These developments did not result from uniform conversion or centralized conquest. They reflected incremental shifts in allegiance driven by practical considerations. By 630 CE, the balance of power in Western Arabia had changed significantly. Mecca's leadership faced constraints that did not exist a decade earlier. The Muslim community, while still not a centralized state, possessed the capacity to project influence beyond Medina. This period demonstrates that Islam's survival did not depend on uninterrupted success. It depended on adaptation to prevailing norms of conflict and alliance. The movement navigated a fragmented political landscape using tools available within that landscape. From a historical perspective, the years 622 to 630 CE are best understood as a phase of consolidation under pressure. Islam existed as a community capable of defending itself, forming alliances, and negotiating its position. It did not yet dominate Arabia, but it had secured a durable presence. The significance of this phase lies in its cumulative effects. Each encounter, agreement, and alliance contributed incrementally to the community's stability. No single event explains the outcome. Survival emerged from a sequence of constrained decisions within a volatile environment. By the end of 630 CE, conditions were in place for a decisive shift in Arabia's religious and political order. That shift did not occur through continuous warfare, nor through sudden transformation, but through the gradual reconfiguration of alliances and authority. By 630 CE, the balance of power in Western Arabia had shifted decisively. The years following the Hijra had seen the Muslim community move from local survival to regional influence through a combination of alliances, negotiated settlements, and limited armed encounters. This cumulative process reached a turning point in 630 CE when Mecca itself was incorporated into the Islamic order. Mecca's position in Arabian society had long rested on its role as a religious sanctuary and commercial center. Control of pilgrimage and the Kaaba sustained both economic activity and political authority. By the late 620s, however, Meccan leadership faced constraints created by altered alliance networks and reduced capacity to isolate Medina. These conditions framed the events of 630 CE. In that year, the Muslim community entered Mecca with limited resistance. The incorporation of the city did not involve extended fighting or large-scale destruction. From a historical standpoint, the significance of this event lies less in military detail than in its institutional consequences. Mecca's religious center was brought under the authority of the movement that had previously been excluded from it. Following the incorporation of Mecca, practices associated with polytheistic worship at the Kaaba were discontinued. The sanctuary was redefined as a site dedicated exclusively to monotheistic worship. This change altered the religious framework of pilgrimage while preserving the site's central role in Arabian religious life. Pilgrimage continued, but under a new theological definition. The integration of Mecca did not eliminate the existing social structure of the city. Clans and households remained intact. Economic activity continued. What changed was the framework of religious authority governing communal practice. Mecca's incorporation symbolized the consolidation of Islam Islam's position within Arabia rather than the beginning of a new phase of expansion. After 630 CE, the Muslim community's influence extended rapidly across much of the peninsula. This extension occurred through a mixture of mechanisms. Some groups entered into formal agreements recognizing Muhammad's authority. Others accepted the new religious framework without confrontation. In many cases, local leaders retained authority within their communities while aligning with the emerging order. It is important to distinguish between conversion and submission in this period. Acceptance of Muhammad's leadership did not always involve immediate or uniform religious adherence. Arabian political culture allowed for layered forms of allegiance. Recognition of authority, agreement to mutual obligations, and participation in shared religious practices could occur at different rates. From 630 to 632 CE, delegations from across Arabia traveled to Medina to negotiate their relationship with the Muslim community. These encounters are recorded in later sources as a sustained process rather than a single event. The presence of such delegations reflects the recognition that the political landscape of Arabia had changed. The consolidation of Islam during this period did not produce a centralized state in the modern sense. Administrative structures remained limited. Governance relied on personal authority, local leadership, and negotiated arrangements. Nevertheless, the scale of recognition achieved by 632 CE exceeded anything seen during earlier phases. Medina continued to function as the primary center of coordination. Religious practice, dispute resolution, and diplomatic engagement were organized from there. The city did not replace Mecca as a religious destination, but it remained the political nucleus of the community. The period after 630 CE also involved the standardization of religious practice. Core acts of worship were observed across communities that aligned with the Islamic framework. These practices reinforced communal identity without requiring centralized enforcement. Oral transmission remained central to religious instruction. During this phase, Muhammad's role encompassed multiple functions. He acted as religious authority, political leader, and arbiter among groups. This concentration of roles was characteristic of leadership in non-state societies, where personal authority substituted for institutional specialization. The absence of a formal succession plan during this period is historically significant. Leadership remained personalized. Authority derived from Muhammad's position rather than from codified procedures. This feature would have implications after 632 CE, but it does not alter the assessment of Islam's establishment by that date. In 632 CE, Muhammad undertook a pilgrimage to Mecca that later sources describe as his final pilgrimage. From a historical standpoint, the event demonstrates the reintegration of Mecca into the religious life of the community under the new framework. It also illustrates the normalization of pilgrimage practices within Islam. Shortly thereafter, in 632 CE, Muhammad died in Medina. His death marked the end of the period in which Islam's foundational structures were shaped directly by its founder. At the time of his death, Islam had achieved recognition across much of the Arabian Peninsula. The survival of the community following Muhammad's death confirms that by 632 CE, Islam was no longer dependent solely on individual proclamation. It had developed shared practices, recognized authority, and a collective identity capable of continuity. These features distinguish an established religious system from an emergent movement. From a historical perspective, Islam's establishment by 632 CE can be assessed through several criteria. First, it possessed a defined religious framework centered on monotheistic worship. Second, it commanded recognition from a wide range of Arabian groups. Third, it maintained a central leadership structure capable of coordinating action across regions. Fourth, it had integrated Mecca, the peninsula's primary religious center, into its system. This establishment did not eliminate regional diversity or local autonomy. Arabian society remained decentralized. However, the overarching framework of allegiance and practice had shifted. Islam functioned as the dominant organizing principle for religious and political affiliation across Arabia. The period from 630 to 632 CE, therefore, represents the final stage of Islam's formative process. Earlier phases introduced the message, ensured survival, and enabled community formation. This final phase completed the integration of Arabia's major centers and secured continuity beyond the founder's lifetime. It is critical to emphasize that this outcome was not the result of a single event or decisive battle. It emerged from cumulative developments over the course of 2 decades. Each phase built upon the previous one without predetermining the next. By the time of Muhammad's death in 632 CE, Islam had transitioned from a local proclamation in Mecca to a peninsula-wide religious and political framework. That transformation defines the endpoint of Islam's beginning as a historical process. The period between 610 and 632 CE defines the beginning of Islam, not because it represents a single event, but because it captures a complete historical process. Within these 22 years, Islam emerged, survived, organized, and secured continuity. Historians identify this span as foundational because it contains all the elements required to distinguish Islam as a historical religion rather than a transient movement. To understand why this time frame is analytically decisive, it is necessary to distinguish between origins, formation, and establishment. These stages are often conflated in popular narratives, but historical method requires that they be separated. Islam did not begin fully formed, nor did it emerge instantaneously as a social system. It developed through identifiable phases that can be traced chronologically. The first boundary is 610 CE. This year marks the appearance of a new religious claim. Before 610, Muhammad functioned within Meccan society as a merchant and clan member. After 610, he asserted that he was receiving authoritative messages that demanded exclusive religious allegiance. From a historical standpoint, this claim is the minimum criterion for identifying the beginning of a religion. Regardless of theological interpretation, a religion begins when a set of teachings is proclaimed with binding authority and communicated to others. Between 610 and 622 CE, Islam existed as a message without institutional backing. This phase demonstrates that Islam did not originate as a political project. It survived for 12 years without territory, armed force, or administrative structure. The endurance of the movement during this period establishes continuity between proclamation and later development. Without this continuity, later success could be attributed to unrelated political circumstances. The Meccan phase anchors Islam's origins in religious proclamation rather than power. The second critical boundary is 622 CE. The Hijra marks the transition from proclamation to community. In Medina, Islam acquired a social base that allowed it to function as an organized collective. This shift explains why the Islamic calendar begins in 622 rather than in 610. The calendar reflects the moment when Islam became viable as a community rather than the moment when the message first appeared. From a historical perspective, this distinction matters. Many religious movements produce teachings but fail to develop stable communities. Islam crossed that threshold in 622. The emergence of the Ummah introduced a new organizing principle that operated alongside existing tribal structures. This was not a rejection of Arabian society, but a reconfiguration of it. Community formation did not replace belief, it sustained it. The third boundary is 632 CE, the year of Muhammad's death. This date is essential because it marks the end of the founding generation. A movement that collapses upon the death of its founder remains historically limited. Islam did not. By 632, it possessed shared practices, recognized authority, and a territorial framework that extended across much of Arabia. Continuity beyond the founder confirms establishment. These 3 points, 610, 622, and 632, define a complete historical arc. Islam began as a proclamation, developed as a community, and was established as a dominant framework within Arabia. Each stage depended on the previous one, but did not predetermine the next. This sequential development explains why historians treat 610 to 632 CE as a single analytical unit. The synthesis also clarifies what the beginning of Islam is not. It is not a single revelation detached from social context. It is not a sudden mass conversion. It is not an inevitable outcome of Arabian conditions. It is not the immediate creation of a state or empire. Each of these assumptions distorts historical understanding. By isolating the period 610 to 632 CE, historians avoid projecting later developments backward. The expansion beyond Arabia, the formation of empires, and the elaboration of legal and theological systems all occurred after 632. Including them in the origin period collapses the distinction between foundation and evolution. Analytical clarity requires separation. This time frame also allows comparison with other religious origins. Christianity, Buddhism, and other traditions similarly developed through extended formative periods rather than single founding moments. Islam fits this broader pattern. Its beginning unfolds through proclamation, community organization, and post-founder continuity. Recognizing this pattern situates Islam within global religious history rather than treating it as an anomaly. The periodization also resolves common confusion regarding calendars. The Islamic calendar begins in 622 CE because that year marks institutional viability, not theological origin. The Christian calendar centers on birth because Christian tradition defines origin differently. Calendrical systems reflect internal religious priorities, not universal historical criteria. Historians must therefore distinguish between theological chronology and analytical periodization. Within 610 to 632 CE, Islam generated durable features that persisted beyond the founding period. These include monotheistic worship centered on a single deity, communal rituals, norms of social obligation, and recognized leadership. These elements did not require later imperial expansion to exist. They were already present by the time of Muhammad's death. It is also important to emphasize that the establishment by 632 does not imply uniformity or completion. Arabia remained diverse. Local autonomy persisted. Allegiance took multiple forms. What changed was the dominant framework within which political and religious affiliation operated. Islam functioned as the primary reference point for legitimacy across the peninsula. This synthesis underscores why historians resist compressing Islam's beginning into a single date. Doing so obscures the process. It also encourages misunderstandings that frame Islam either as purely spiritual or purely political. The 610 to 632 CE model captures both dimensions without reducing one to the other. The beginning of Islam, therefore, is best understood as a historical process with clear boundaries, not as a singular event. The process begins with revelation, continues through survival and organization, and concludes with establishment and continuity. Each stage can be documented, sequenced, and analyzed using a historical method. By completing the narrative at 632 CE, the documentary reaches the end of Islam's formative phase without entering later interpretive debates. What follows, succession, expansion, and doctrinal development, belongs to a different historical inquiry. The origins are complete once the religion demonstrates the capacity to endure beyond its founder. This analytical framework explains why scholars consistently define the beginning of Islam as occurring between 610 and 632 CE. It is the only periodization that accounts for emergence, formation, and establishment without distortion. It captures Islam's origins as history rather than legend, process rather than event, and development rather than inevitability.